I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. Well, as I said, welcome to week 2. Really nice to see everyone with their webcams on. Just remember to turn off any of your mics so there's no feedback. And if your microphone's not great, you can always call in with a telephone instead. And we're going to do a little icebreaker to get started and get everyone using the chat. So if you can just answer a surprisingly controversial question of what color is a tennis ball, and just kind of throw that in the chat. Tennis ball color. Great, Chris. Looks like got some good answers here. I also think it's green, so I was surprised that it was at all controversial. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if you have a question or anything and I don't notice it in the chat, I'm going to talk for the first half, and then Stephen's going to take over for the second half. Feel free to just unmute yourself and interrupt me too. So you all probably know where you're at. So this is our second lecture for the adaptation planning and practices for wildlife management. And again, just want to acknowledge our really great team. And you're all here, but if you want to go back and look, just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded so that it'll be posted on the YouTube page for NIACS, along with all of the other course material. And there will be a follow-up email with the lecture link. And again, if your spam folder is picking up those, just keep an eye on your spam folder if you're not getting those follow-up emails. If you're still not getting the emails, reach out to Patricia. And I know there are a couple of people who aren't getting the newsletter, and she's on it. So just make sure you're getting those because they have really important information. And then I will turn this slide over to Stephen.
Great, and this is a prompt for me to turn it over to Nikki von Hedeman from Colorado State University. Nikki, I saw you're with us. Can you unmute yourself? And
yeah, hi.
Thanks. Please tell us how these folks can contribute to climate adaptation research.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for giving me a bit of space here. So my name's Nikki von Hedeman. I'm a research associate in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University, and I'm working with Courtney Schultz from the Public Lands Policy Group. We're working on a new project with the Forest Service's Office of Sustainability and Climate, and also Courtney Peterson from NIACS, on a project assessing the impacts of NIACS's climate adaptation courses like this one. We're interested in determining how the courses are affecting climate adaptation planning and then implementation of actions. What are the major barriers to implementing climate adaptive actions, and then how these answers vary by region and land ownership. So I am interested in interviewing you course participants shortly after the course concludes in April, as well as we're also following up with interviewees 1 year after the course so we can kind of understand how perceptions and plans for adaptation shifted after participation. And then barriers you face to adaptation, and then what actions were possible within the first year. So I'm just here to, I'm here observing the course. I plan to email you all towards the end of the course with more information about the study and to ask if you'd be interested in participating in interviews. All of our interviews are completely voluntary and confidential. So if you don't want to participate, that's totally fine. I just want to give you a heads up that we are interested in talking to you all about the impact of the courses. So just let me know if you have any questions or concerns about our study or my participation in the course. But I'm really looking forward to kind of just observing and participating and understanding, learning more from this course, and then seeing what you all are I'm really interested in seeing the projects that come up. So that should be really interesting for me. So thanks.
Thanks, Nikki. And just selfishly, I'll also add that all of us at NIACS And I'm sure I can add Marta and Olivia and Ben and Chris Hoving to this as well. We're really interested to hear feedback like this and to hear what are the stumbling blocks, what are the pitfalls, what is going really well. This is how we move the whole land management community forward on climate adaptation. Our NIACS team, we know we're going to continue doing courses like this. And so it's really important to us to get unvarnished feedback about what's going well and how can we continue to improve. So thank you, Nikki.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing the results, and it definitely informs the work we do and how we reach out and the kind of assistance that we provide. So really looking forward to that. So our agenda for today is we're going to really cover step 2 of the adaptation workbook and go over some key concepts related to that, and spend a little bit of time talking about some resources that will be useful as you think about climate change vulnerability in this workshop and beyond. Like last week, we'll cover a lot of ground, probably take up most of the hour, but this will be the last kind of long lecture in a while. And as always, at the wrap up of this lecture, Stephen will outline this week's assignment and homework for next week. So before I get started, I wanted to share some kind of summary information on who's in the class and where you all are working. So in the last session, we were introduced to course projects. Most of these projects are in the Midwest and Northeast, but there are additional projects in other regions. So, welcome to everyone. It's nice to see kind of the layout across the country. So step 2, last week, we completed step 1 of defining goals and objectives. Hopefully people between last week's lecture and the discussion are feeling pretty comfortable now with those goals and objectives. So this week, we're going to move on to focusing on step 2 and really diving into thinking about assessing climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, and about specific regional and local climate impacts in your area. So a lot of this lecture will be talking about how we think about vulnerability and some of the resources that hopefully you'll find helpful. So step 2 is to assess site-specific climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. So we're going to be answering kind of 2 main questions in this section. What climate change impacts and vulnerabilities are most important to your species and project area, and how vulnerable is your species and project area? So first, always great to define what we mean. So what do we mean by vulnerability? So vulnerability is going to be the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate vulnerability and extremes. And in this case, when we're talking about systems, we're talking about your focal species, habitat, kind of everything that gets wrapped up into that. And don't worry too much about like memorizing this definition. We're going to really spend some time breaking it down. So when we think about vulnerability, we often think about 2 kind of broad components. I would argue 3 broad components, because we're going to further split out this potential impacts. But we can kind of group these into potential impacts and adaptive capacity. So this is the definition when you're thinking about vulnerability and your vulnerability assessments. This is really the definition that we'll use in this framework. So like I said, with potential impacts, we really think about two parts of this potential impacts. So if we're answering the big question of, are the potential impacts likely to support or disrupt the health and function of the system, we want to think about what is the system. So your species and habitat, what is the system exposed to? So how is climate changing? You can think about rainfall, extreme storm events, maybe shifting seasonality of some of those climate factors, other stressors like disease. So that's going to be one component is, what's the exposure within the system. But then the other part is how sensitive is the system to those changes. Always helpful to think about some examples. So this is a forestry example in the case of if you had two forests, they could both be exposed to 3 degrees of warming. So that gets that exposure, that change in temperature. But in terms of how sensitive they are, in an alpine forest with spruce trees, it might be more sensitive, say, than a forest with oak trees. Or for example, if you thought about shifting seasons of rainfall, maybe summers and falls are getting drier, and say you're dealing with a seasonal wetlands, and that's going to start drying down in the fall. You're thinking, I'm a herpetologist, so I think about amphibians most of the time. So you're thinking about a species of frog that uses that wetlands to reproduce, a species that reproduces in, say, the winter with a short larval period. Those frogs may be up and out of the wetland before it dries down. So in that case, it's going to be less sensitive, say, than a species that reproduces in the height of summer or has a long larval period. So they're exposed to the same change, but it's that summer breeding species in that system that's going to be more sensitive to the change. But in this case, it may be that, those frogs can shift the timing of the breeding. Maybe the breeding doesn't have to do so much with the time of year, so much as the water availability. So the species may actually shift, that local population may actually shift and start breeding earlier in the season. So this is where we start thinking about this adaptive capacity, thinking about how well the system can cope with potential impacts. So another way to think about this is how resilient is the system to potential impacts. So that's assuming, usually when we think about the initial adaptive capacity, we're not thinking quite as much about how our management might kind of buffer some of those negative effects. So another example of a species that might have pretty high adaptive capacity would, for example, be a generalist species that even if the food sources shift in terms of what food is available at what time of year, a generalist species may have a higher adaptive capacity. So maybe they're eating a certain insect historically, and that insect's phenology shifts, so they're no longer coming into contact as much with them. But if they're kind of will eat whatever they can find and there's still insects on the landscape, they may do fine compared to a really specialized species that may not have that adaptive capacity. So these, when you're thinking about vulnerability, these are going to be the two really broad bins, that potential impacts and then adaptive capacity. The last thing that I'll mention on adaptive capacity is do a little plug for a paper that our very own Chris Hoving is part of, that came out in Conservation Biology. I believe the actual paper is behind the paywall, but the thing that I wanted to mention is there's a really good supplement with this paper that includes adaptive actions and case studies as they relate to specific adaptive capacity attributes. So I thought this was a really interesting read, and it's a really comprehensive list of case studies at the end. So if you're interested in thinking more about this adaptive capacity, or are confused by it and want to see some more examples, that's a good place to turn. And just to kind of wrap up before I inundate you with a lot of resources to get at these questions, just kind of summarize and go back. If we want to think about these potential impacts we really think about these direct and indirect effects of climate change. So for exposure, we're often thinking about things like temperature, precipitation, other major drivers and stressors, phenology, so the timing of when that species is doing different things, the reproductive success. So maybe a reproductive success is often tied to specific temperature, precipitation conditions. And then we also, when we're thinking about vulnerability, it's really important to think about that system's adaptive capacity. So how well it's going to respond to that change. So is it resilient to those climate effects? So thinking about plasticity or species tolerance. So some species just have much broader tolerances, those generalists. You can also think about it more at the habitat level in terms of how much diversity of habitat there is, if it's a species that maybe can kind of shift and move potentially between microclimates, things like that. And then another part that we haven't really touched on is how well does that system kind of respond to disturbance? So does it have the ability to kind of bounce back after a disturbance event? So you can think about, a species that is potentially longer lived, right? If you have some of these like storm events or other disturbance events, maybe they'll do fine and be able to recover the next year, even if there's potentially like a lost year of reproduction. Whereas if you think about something that's pretty short-lived, maybe they won't be able to locally recover. So I will pause there, see if anyone has questions about potential impacts, adaptive capacity, before we move into some resources. Okay, and if you think of anything, again, keeping an eye on the chat as much as possible, so feel free to just throw things in. So resources, going to try and do this without kind of throwing too much at you. There are, a great list of, a lot of these resources are in your syllabus, and there are some resources in your syllabus that I'm not talking about. But really, when you're going through step 2, we really want to make sure that you have a variety of resources. We're working on pretty different projects in different parts of the country. So you're going to have to do a little bit of digging to really figure out what the best resources are in terms of thinking about climate change specific to your project. And I'm going to start as kind of broad within the national concept as we can. So starting with the National Climate Assessment. So this is the NCA 4 chapter summaries. So the next National Climate Assessment is currently being written. That's why one of our instructors, Olivia Ledee, we have not witnessed her on these calls, as she is furiously writing that right now. But when you go to the National Climate Assessment, this is always where I start. And if you're thinking about which of these chapters are probably most relevant to the work we're doing in this course, are that second chapter, that Our Changing Climate, is a good place to go to kind of look at those broad trends. They're broken out by region, looking at temperature and precipitation, both kind of historic changes and then projected changes in seasonality of precipitation events. This is often, I get a lot of questions in my work about how much extreme events will change. This can kind of be the best place to go for some of that. If you're working in forests, look at the forests, ecosystems, biodiversity. Those are good places to look to. And then the other would be looking at your specific region. So in those regional chapters, they're easy to read, kind of quick overviews. If you search just NCA, sometimes you get the one before 2018. Still a useful resource. They try not to repeat too much of the same information. So sometimes it is worthwhile to check an older one too. I know this, I guess it's 2022, the new one will try to build off of 2018 instead of kind of repeating and re-summarizing. So good to look at 2014, but 2018 would be where I would send you first. If you want to kind of zoom in a little bit more, so NOAA puts out these state climate summaries, which will kind of summarize things again at the state level, which might be more useful. Some aspects of climate may be better summarized in the NCA, some might be better summarized in the state climate summaries. The 2022 version just came out. So they look at both the historic climate records. So here's an example, sticking in Michigan. So this is an example, say, of days with high precipitation. So they have both the historic record here, which is what you see with the graph. And you can see that, you know, the average number of days with precipitation of 2 inches or more in the last 3 time slices that they put up there, we've been above that. So you can look at trends like that. And then they also describe in the text some of those predicted changes. So for example, increases in precipitation are projected for Michigan, most likely during the winter and spring. So this I think is probably pretty useful to a lot of your projects. I certainly use the NOAA climate summaries a lot. So when we're thinking of these and other resources for looking at vulnerability, of course, these first 2 examples are going to hit on that exposure part, right? So these will, you know, summarize those broad climate changes in your region. So how some of those exposure points might change. There are other resources that, depending on what system you're working on, may get more into those climate vulnerabilities we're interested in. You might also have to go to kind of primary literature or other sources to get your specific species where they're to connect that exposure to sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Another resource is going to be the NIACS vulnerability assessments. So depending on where you're working. So we do have a lot of projects that really overlap pretty well with these regions. So these are going to be pretty comprehensive. They'll contain vulnerability assessments. NIACS also puts out impact lists and videos. There's tree species projected suitability. So maps of that. You also, depending, of course, on your region, will have kind of more specific, tailored, descriptive summaries of some of these changes that can be a really helpful spot to go for thinking about not only exposure, but then also sensitivity. You might be getting at the habitat, and then you'll probably have to make those connections to wildlife in most of these instances. Those NIACS tree atlas changes to tree distributions then are also used in the Forest Service bird atlas. So this uses the current distributions from breeding bird surveys and then data on climate, elevation, and those tree species distributions to project future suitable habitat under 2 different emission scenarios, I believe, and for many species. So this is a good place to go. So this, right, is maybe not comprehensively including sensitivity because we're dealing with potentially a coarser scale and looking at just certain climate variables and trees. But that's going to get at if you're thinking about something like a bird species that may get at a fair amount of that exposure and sensitivity part. I like the bird atlas because it includes a lot of information on the actual models that they run. So what's kind of the back end of this, and then also the reliability of the model. Another source that does similar things, but without quite as much of the background, kind of what goes into it, but creates very nice pictures. So these are the same, I did common loons for both. But Audubon has this survival by degrees maps. These will just come up if you search Audubon and your species of interest. They have a couple of different warming scenarios. You can do, right, for migratory species, you can look at different seasons. So birds, of course, are going to have really complex biotic interactions, habitat needs, etc. So these are a really great starting point, but you really need to think about the scale that you're managing at. Think about what aspect within that. So they call this climate vulnerability. But if we go back to our definition of climate vulnerability, I would argue that we're getting at exposure for sure. We're getting at some of the sensitivity because these are built off of kind of the current relationships between climate and species distributions, but we're potentially missing that adaptive capacity aspect. So I think these are really great starting points, but I would say to kind of, really think critically about how you're using them. And yeah, great. Thank you, Caitlin, for putting the study background. I looked into that. I wish they had a quick button on their website to get right to that. But yeah, I think these are really great, places to start. Especially I like the seasonality aspect of them. Again, these are resources for birds. There tend to be, as I said, I'm a herpetologist, so I'm always a little bit like everyone who works on birds gets all the cool resources. So I know we have a lot of projects that aren't on birds or aren't on kind of the species of birds that are potentially included in these projects. So, if you're hitting kind of snags on where to look for those other resources, I know Chris is going to talk some about this tomorrow. And then we are all, as your instructors, great resources to kind of point you in directions for where to get at some of those other questions of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. With that, I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Marta. We can pause now and see if any folks have questions for Marta about climate resources or about definitions of climate vulnerability. Marta, while we're doing that, I'm going to pull an Audible on you, and I think I'm going to run my part of the presentation from my own desktop.
That makes it easy for me, so I will stop my share.
Okay, any questions for Marta? Okay, Marta, can you give me a thumbs up? Are you seeing my screen? Great. Okay, so as promised, now just a few details about how to actually run through step 2 in the adaptation workbook tool, just to make sure folks are not lost as you go through this step, because this is one of the more demanding, time-intensive steps of the adaptation workbook. But I'll show you a couple of things we have done to prompt you and at least give you a starter list of information to consider for climate impacts for your projects. Big picture, what we're really looking for here in step 2 is for you to identify regional climate impacts that are highest priority for your species, for your habitats, for the places where you're working. And so you'll be presented with some of those, and you'll have resources now available to you to help you pull out some of those big ticket items about regional climate impacts or vulnerabilities. But then we know just a limitation of working with climate change information is that a lot of it is written at scales that are much larger than the scales of your projects. And so this demands some interpretation and kind of mental downscaling on your part. And that's a significant part of what we're asking you to do in this step, is to translate regional climate impacts and to think about, well, what about this regional trend is most pertinent at the scale of my project or for the species I'm working? How is it going to play out in this place at this scale? And so we're asking you to try to put as much as you can a local flavor or a local interpretation of these larger regional climate trends. And this is something that no one else can do for you. That's why this climate adaptation planning is not just a copy-paste sort of exercise, and it really hinges on your knowledge and expertise. And that should be encouraging. It's also what makes it demanding. And so that leads me to my first tip. Just as you begin going through step 2 in this adaptation workbook, you're going to see a lot of questions and prompts that relate to your project site or your property or your project area. And so we use those terms kind of interchangeably here. And especially for this wildlife course, when you see those terms, just think about what's the scale of my project. Because some of you are working on individual properties, say looking at an individual stream. Some of you are looking at large wildlife management areas, right, that are much larger than, say, a conventional private property. At least a couple of you are working at much larger scales, like Austin, looking at the full 1836 ceded territory. And so you might see a question that has to do with property and think, well, it's not my property, that's an awkward fit. Just a recognition that we were trying to be flexible when creating this tool. And so you get to replace those terms with your project area. So what does this mental downscaling look like? Regional trends to site-specific impacts. I'm going to show you just a couple generic examples here. So for my dummy project that I put through, my wildlife ranch in Iowa near my hometown that I've shown on my screen a couple of times at the lecture here. So just as an example, when I drop a pin and create my project in the adaptation workbook, step 2 is going to present me with a laundry list of regional climate impacts that are drawn from that national climate assessment that Marta mentioned. And so I'm just showing you a couple of those there. These are a couple regional climate impacts for that Midwest region of the national climate assessment. And so we're asking you to take these regional climate trends and think specifically how might they play out at the scale of your project area. And so I'm thinking about not just the frequency and intensity of cold waves, but I'm thinking specifically about snowpack duration for my wolverine habitat. And I'm thinking not just about droughts generally, but I'm thinking about what they mean for the water level in my ponds. And do I know anything about the ponds on my property and which of them might be more or less susceptible to water level declines? So again, this is your opportunity to show your knowledge and show your familiarity with the landscape or property that you're working in. So when you created your project, when you defined its location, the adaptation workbook is going to do some work behind the scenes so that when you enter step 2, you will be presented with a list of 15 or more climate impact statements, depending on which region you happen to land in. If you land in one of these blue shaded regions on the map, you'll get regional summaries from those national climate assessments. If you land in one of the smaller green regions, you'll get slightly more detailed climate impact statements from one of our NIACS vulnerability assessments. And this is just a starter list of prompts for you. You can click anytime you see an eye icon that I'm showing you on the screen, you can click that to get more information about where is this impact statement coming from, what's the literature that's supporting this, and where can I go to learn more. So you'll be working in your dashboard, kind of like this, and you'll see all of these regional climate impacts when you're hovering on this regional tab in the left-hand panel. That's where you'll see all these regional climate impacts. Scan through these. You may see some of these impact statements that clearly don't apply to your species, to your property area, whatever the case may be, right? You may be in a region that includes some coastal impacts, that you may have an inland project that is not affected by sea level rise, or whatever the case may be, right? So feel free to get rid of impacts that don't apply. And then to do that local interpretation, you're going to be clicking on those comment bubbles icons after each general impact statement. You see there's a prompt there. How might this affect your property or project area? And there's that comment bubble. That's where you go to add your notes to make this more descriptive and more localized to your property or your project area or your species. When you go, and this page is going to be organized by the management topics that you created. Okay, so you've got this laundry list of regional climate impacts. If you create custom management topics, you'll start out with no suggested impacts. What you can do though is you can copy and paste from that regional list. If there are certain regional impacts that are more applicable to, say, wolverines and not applicable to waterfowl, you can copy them in and create a customized list for each of your management topics. You do that with this orange button here, where you're adding climate impacts. You can go to that regional tab and copy, or you may be coming up with your own climate impacts, gathering information from those resources that Marta suggested. And so this is where you're adding in the general impact and then specific details for your property or project area. You can also keep a track of where you're getting this information with this orange Add Evidence button. That's a chance for you to add the citation of the literature, add the link for the paper that you found, or add the authors and the title, so that you can go back to that information later on and you can share a complete package with your coworkers or with your clients. And so what you will eventually end up with, I'm not showing you the completed version, but you're going to end up with your own customized list of climate impacts in this working panel that are relevant for each of your management topics. And draw as many of those as you can from this regional list that we provide you from the National Climate Assessment. Okay, so going back to the real example that I shared in lecture last week, a hybrid team of folks from multiple organizations looking at the central Platte River Valley, and specifically at a 12-mile section of the river corridor that includes some conservation land, some agricultural land, riparian forests, ranches, row crops. This team of folks came together at a workshop, went through the same process that you're going through now, generally to think about how can we implement more wildlife compatible agricultural practices and how can we improve habitat in this riparian corridor for sandhill cranes and other wildlife, other migratory birds in particular. So this is just a recap of that project. And then just a little more detail on how they completed step 2 of the adaptation workbook. They had a similar starting point of information, regional level, climate change impacts from the National Climate Assessment for the multi-state region, including Nebraska. So I'm showing you just 4 of those regional climate impacts that they thought were highest priority. And then some of the local details that they started sketching in about why does this regional impact matter to this section of the riparian corridor. So that's step 2.1. There's a second part of step 2, which basically asks you to do kind of a summation vulnerability rating for each of your management topics. And so like Marta said, we ask you to think about impacts as well as adaptive capacity as separate components that add up to overall climate vulnerability. And so after you go through your laundry list of climate impacts and you add all of your project area specific details, you'll come to step 2.2, which asks you to make a vulnerability determination for each of your management topics. And so, you get to pick and choose and decide whether those impacts from climate change are going to be very supportive to your species or your habitat or your project area, or very disruptive. And then you make the same determination about adaptive capacity. Does your system have low adaptive capacity or high adaptive capacity? And this can be kind of like a gut check moment. This does not have to be a precision ranking that we're going to ask you to testify in front of a judge. Why were you moderate and not moderate high? The idea here is to get a general sense of your vulnerability. And the tool, based on your sliders, it will kind of show you where you roughly end up in a 2-dimensional graph that shows overall climate vulnerability, and it'll clue you into whether you're indicating that your system has high, moderate, or low vulnerability. And if you end up in a place that feels really out of tune with how you're thinking, that's a signal that you can go back and look again at your list of climate impacts and look at the local, the local interpretation of those impacts, and then go back to those sliders and see, okay, does this really add up the way that it should, or is there something that I need to recognize that maybe didn't come through in my notes? We'll say this again and again in this workbook. There's not a right and wrong way to fill out this step, as long as you're putting in your expertise and judgment, right? So the wrong way to do it, I'll backtrack. There is a wrong way to do this step. And that's if you just rely on the regional impacts and don't put in any of your local expertise and judgment. As long as you're doing that, you're in the best position to decide your overall climate change vulnerability. All of us instructors are happy to talk about the intricacies of this if you're having a hard time making a decision. And like Marta said, if you're looking for more resources and information, we're happy to help ferret out more ways to fill out your list of climate impacts. Don't start thinking about adaptation yet. just be thinking about, how does this affect my property? How does this affect my project area? How does this affect the species that I'm focusing on? You don't have to think about, what does this mean for my management objectives yet? You don't have to think about, how am I going to cope with these climate impacts yet? We will be doing that later. So for next week, we're going to be asking you to do this research and legwork to review climate impacts and vulnerability, to compile those lists of climate impacts for all of your management topics. Please use the syllabus and the resources that we provided there as a springboard. Contact us if you need more help or more regionally specific resources. Complete step 2, complete the homework that's following step 2. All of that by next Monday. This is going to be one of the more intensive weeks. Bonus opportunity for folks tomorrow morning. Chris Hoving is going to be giving that national overview of climate change impacts on wildlife, and how does climate, different examples of how climate change might affect reproductive success, elements of habitat, including food, water, and cover, diseases, human-wildlife interactions, right? All of the bigger picture of the ways that climate change can affect wildlife. So I'd encourage you definitely to attend Chris's lecture or watch the recording. We'll send out a link after the lecture is complete. And now's another chance to pause and see if there are questions.
Hey, Stephen.
Yeah.
Hi. Just curious if Apostle Island's vulnerability assessment was incorporated into the system.
It's not one of those preloaded assessments.
Okay.
Yeah. Peggy is lucky. Peggy has a vulnerability assessment that is specific just for her landscape. So you're definitely a leg up.
But we do have a really complicated landscape.
Leg up and a leg down. Good question.
Sorry.
So we're just looking at how climate change will impact our project area. We're not thinking about any of the adaptation this week. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
You can, problem solving just creeps up naturally. Definitely capture those ideas, keep them in a notebook or something on the side.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
I will mention, so I scanned the homework questions at the beginning of lecture today. First, thanks everyone for completing your homework. I think we had 19 out of 21 projects submit the homework. And I had 2 folks email me this morning and say, oh my gosh, my dog ate my homework and I'll get it to you as soon as I can. So that's amazing. That's our 21 all accounted for. A couple of folks had really good questions. Some of you asked, can we at some point go back and edit our goals and objectives if we learn more about the property, or as we come to new realizations through this process? Yes, you can. Specifically in step 3 of the adaptation workbook is a natural place to do that. That's where we're going to be examining, does climate change affect the feasibility of the management objectives that you started with? You'll have an opportunity there to go back and edit if you feel like, oh, this is no longer feasible and I don't want to hang my hat on this goal anymore. You can go back and edit it, and the workbook will update that for you. You don't have to do that now, but you will have the opportunity. So a couple of you are already thinking about that. Good question. Anything else? Marta, Patricia, am I missing anything?
Looks like Andrew has a question.
Oh, great. Fire away, please.
Are you able to, I think you're still muted. There you go.
Okay. Deer, are they considered part of the climate change? And I'm not sure if I get the right terminology, but herbivory? How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, herbivory.
Herbivory.
So yes, I mean, this is something that we hear foresters talk about all the time up here in the upper Midwest for sure, that deer browse impacts on tree regeneration, for example, and understory vegetation it's already a big problem, kind of independent of climate change. But if climate change means milder winters and larger survival of juvenile deer and a larger deer herd in the future, then yes, that's a climate impact that you can include in step 2.
But isn't that a political hunting problem? Because you have the ticks and you have other things going after the deer and moose.
It's both. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a climate connection if you're in an area where winter severity is one of the main controls on deer population. And if a milder winter means greater deer, then yes, you have to kind of hold and this is one of those where you can wade into adaptation speculation, but you can start to anticipate, well, what's my state agency going to do in the future? Are they going to change hunting limits to account for any changing population issues? Try not to do that speculation right now. Just try to assume that current hunting levels remain the same. What would be the implication of that?
And with deer, we also think, right, so at least up here in the kind of the far northern US, we're at the edge of we're at kind of the area where deer and moose overlap a little bit, and potentially as things warm up and, like Steven said, milder winters kind of free up those deer populations, they expand. At the same time, the moose are getting stressed out by the warmer conditions in the summer. And as the deer kind of expand and move in, we're potentially getting more of those other stressors that I didn't really talk too much on, but just sort of mention if we're thinking about kind of new interactions between species. So if deer and moose are coming into contact more, there might be more opportunities for spreading some of those diseases. So like you said, those ticks can be a big problem, and other diseases too that would spread. So yeah, so deer are definitely a thing to think about depending on where you are when you're thinking about climate impacts.
All right, last opportunity. Any burning questions before we wrap up for today? Okay, well, again, pro tips to get you on the right direction. You will see that pre-populated list of climate impacts. Remove them if they don't apply, copy them and paste them into your specific management topics if that is a quicker way to build your list of relevant climate impacts. Hit every comment bubble, put in your locally specific notes and interpretation about how this climate impact might play out or why it's particularly relevant for your species or project area. Go beyond our list and add your own custom impacts. And let us know if you have questions. And with that, good luck. And we look forward to hearing what you come up with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.